Good morning, everyone. This is John with Gun.Deals, and today we are going to be talking about if the HPA passes in the big, beautiful bill in the Senate, and that is quite a large if. But before we get into that, while you're here, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and does help us out quite a bit. And go ahead and comment the most likely outcome of the HPA and the big beautiful bill in the comments down below. As of right now, your guess is quite literally just as good as mine. Now, if you're not familiar with the HPA or the Hearing Protection Act, essentially what it does is remove suppressors from the NFA. That means removing the $200 tax stamp, the waiting period, the fingerprints, and all of the assorted paperwork and nonsense that comes with an NFA item. Now, something like this would never pass on its own, which is why they snuck it into the big beautiful bill, as it's called, in hopes to get it through where it is currently through the House and sitting on the Senate floor. But whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, today we are going to be taking a look at the positive outlook on things. So if the HPA passes within the big beautiful bill and gets signed into law, what happens next? Well, as you can probably expect, the first thing to happen is everybody goes out and buys a bunch of suppressors, and the legislators in more restrictive states will rush out there to try to impose restrictions on what people can and cannot get, according to state law, instead of just relying on the federal law. Now, what this means for me and you is that you can probably go into your local store for a couple days anyways, and pick out suppressors minus the tax stamp, minus the $200 fee, minus the waiting period, and you'll have a great time. However, that will create one of the biggest gold rushes for suppressor companies of all time in a matter of days, and then stock will probably completely run out, which, when stock gets very low, you may start to see people charge a lot more for their suppressors. So you might not have to pay a $200 tax stamp, but you might have to pay a $200 markup tax just because, hey, we can make more money off of our suppressors now that everybody's buying them. And for some people, maybe that's a nice trade-off because they'd rather give $200 to the company rather than to your government and not have to give them fingerprints along the way. Now, I'm not really the type of person to recommend people rush out and panic buy and get everything that they can right now when they'll never come back in stock. I think that in the short term, you will see a very restricted supply chain, as suppressor companies can't just magically 10x their supply overnight. However, what you will see, since these will no longer be regulated under the NFA in this hypothetical scenario, you will see the barrier to entry to the suppressor market basically be removed. Rather than having to have a special operational tax, all you will need to have is an FFL if you want to sell completed suppressors, or if you want to sell 80% kits. What used to be known as Form 1 suppressor companies, well, now they can just ship them directly to you. You can 3D print your own suppressors, and you would be able to manufacture your own suppressors at home with complete impunity in most free states. Now, nothing is really going to change on the high end. The top dollar, most in-demand suppressors will just go up in price, probably, and have even higher demand as more people are flooding the market. They're still going to be hard to find, or become even harder to find. Certain muzzle devices that people are always on the lookout for will be even harder to find as more people are trying to purchase them. However, all of this demand will eventually be met by new supply, as again, lower barriers to entry to the market will facilitate a lot of new companies coming into the market to fill that demand need. And again, I think we're going to see in the low and mid range a lot of new suppressors coming out, things that are simple, that could be manufactured quickly and in volume and be sold for relatively cheap. Even if it's a $50 part that they can sell for $300 because demand is still incredibly high, I think you are going to see a flood of new companies in the suppressor market because it will be a proverbial gold rush, kind of like it was for a while with the FRTs or even with pistol braces, where the market has a new thing that everybody wants that's relatively easy to manufacture and can be sold for relatively high margins, unlike most things in the gun industry. So for instance, an AR might only be sold at a 10 to 20% margin at best, but a suppressor, well, you might be able to sneak out 50% or more margin on a single suppressor, because again, a lot of the times these things are not complex parts. If I had to guess what the low-end suppressor market is going to look like in 6 months to a year, well, I would say it's going to look like it already does in other countries where suppressors simply aren't regulated. You're going to see $99 cans sold over the counter because they're essentially just welded tubes of steel and they're not complex parts. Now, the 3D printed additive manufacturing suppressors, titanium, Inconel, all these really special materials and special designs, those are still going to be more expensive because they're already more expensive to produce, but because there's not going to be that barrier to entry of the $200 tax stamp, of the waiting period, of the fingerprints, all the other hassle you have to go through with the NFA, you're going to see a much higher demand on the civilian side of things, which is going to entice even more companies into that market. Now, when it comes to actually manufacturing suppressors, there are already a lot of companies that have manufacturing capabilities that could spin out tens or hundreds of thousands of suppressors in a relatively short amount of time frame, but right now that machine time is being used up on other components. But it could pretty easily be switched over to suppressor designs, as again, suppressors, when you boil them down for the last 100 years or so, have been incredibly simple, and only in the last 20 to 30 years have people tried to get more and more complex with their designs, and at their base, a generic cheap suppressor performs 95% as good as a super high-tech. One sort of funny example of this is the new Q suppressor is the exact same thing as the old Maxim suppressor, only separated by 123 years, and touted as cutting-edge technology. So if the HPA passes, suppressors will be very hard to find, out of stock, and more expensive in the short run, for sure, guaranteed. In the long run, 6 months to a year, some people are saying 2+ years to actually fully catch up with the demand for suppressors. Again, if all of this passes the HPA, you will probably see a much wider variety of suppressors on the market. You're going to see the low and mid end really start to fill up. For instance, a company like PSA that already has manufacturing capability, or any company that has real manufacturing capability, well, they can spin up suppressors pretty darn quick, sell them for cheap, and still make great margins on them. And you can combine your PSA suppressor with your AAC ammo to see which one blows up first. I might be somewhat of an optimist when it comes to the effects of removing suppressors from the NFA. However, when it comes to actually getting the HPA to pass and remove suppressors from the said NFA, well, that is the tricky part. Now, you can call your senators all you like and pretend that they actually listen to you, but if I were to take a guess and to be realistic, I think it is likely that a couple members of the Senate will shoot this big, beautiful bill down and remove any chances of the greatest 2A rights victory within our lifetimes. Sorry to leave you guys on a little bit of a dour note, but that's about all that I have for you today. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off. Ejected. Terrible. Uh-oh. Another setting open? All right. Pretty neat. Maybe those are supersonic. Didn't actually lock back, though. It probably even needs one more setting. But that was quite funny.